If you can tame this stallion, Cowboy, my prettiest daughter is yours." That was the promise the sheriff made in front of the whole town, a promise that glittered like gold under the harsh sun of Dusty Creek. But in a town built on dust and desperation, promises had a way of turning to dirt. And this one was buried in a lie so deep it would take a fool to dig it up. Ethan Cole was that fool. The town square was a powder keg of anticipation that Saturday morning. It was Bride's Fair Day, the one time a year a man with land could claim a wife without a dowry, provided he could prove his worth. And Sheriff Hargrove, standing on that rickety wooden platform, was the man who decided what worth meant. His chest was puffed out, his silver star gleaming, but it was the treasure behind him that held every man's gaze. His three daughters. Amelia, the eldest, was a vision in a rose-colored gown, her dark hair a perfect waterfall of curls. Beside her, Margaret and Violet shimmered in blue and yellow silk, each one a prize. The crowd was a low hum of whispers. "Finest girls in 3 counties," a man grunted, his eyes fixed on Amelia. One by one, local ranchers stepped up, offering cattle, deeds, promises of wealth. Each one was met with a polite but firm dismissal from the sheriff. They weren't good enough. Not for his Amelia. Then the crowd parted. Ethan Cole stepped forward, and a hush fell over the square. He didn't belong. His shoulders were broad, his hands calloused, but his clothes were the color of the trail, and his boots were caked in the dust of a man who walked more than he rode. He was an outsider, a nobody. The sheriff looked him up and down, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "And who might you be, stranger?" Ethan's voice was steady, cutting through the silence. "Name's Ethan Cole. I own a small ranch 20 miles north. By your law, Sheriff, any man who can provide has a right to ask for a bride." A wave of snickers rolled through the crowd. "Land?" someone shouted from the back. "Probably a shack and 2 chickens." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his eyes never left the sheriff. "I've got skill," he said, his voice rising. "I can break horses, work cattle, build what needs building." He was a man who worked with his hands, and he wasn't ashamed of it. The sheriff's smirk widened into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. It was the grin of a predator that had just seen its prey walk willingly into a trap. "Skill, you say?" He leaned forward, his voice booming for all to hear. "Then prove it." The trap was sprung. "I've got a stallion, black as midnight, mean as the devil himself. He's a killer. Put 2 trainers in the dirt and sent a third running for the hills with his tail between his legs. No man can get near him." The crowd leaned in, their earlier mockery turning to bloodlust. They smelled a spectacle. The sheriff pointed a thick finger at Ethan. "You tame that horse, Cowboy," he declared, his voice dripping with false generosity as he gestured toward the radiant Amelia. "And my daughter is yours." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Amelia, at her perfect dress, her flawless skin, the way she held herself like a queen surveying her subjects. She was the validation he'd spent his entire life fighting for. A chance to be somebody, a chance to wash away the dirt and loneliness of his past. He looked back at the sheriff, his mind made up. "I accept." The sheriff's grin turned downright vicious. "You've got 3 months. Come fall, we'll see if you're still walking." The crowd roared, the sound a mix of cheers for the show and laughter at the fool who'd just signed his own death warrant. Ethan didn't hear them. His gaze was locked on Amelia. She fanned herself lazily, her expression one of utter boredom. She hadn't even bothered to look at him. But she would. He would make her. He would tame the devil, and he would claim his prize. He had to. It was the only way. But what Ethan didn't know was that this wasn't about a horse. It was about a secret. And the prize he was fighting for wasn't the one he thought it was. 2 days later, Ethan arrived at the Hargrove Ranch. It was an imposing place, a large whitewashed house that screamed of money and power. But Ethan wasn't interested in the house. His focus was on a reinforced timber corral set far back from the main stables. He heard the beast before he saw it, the splintering crack of wood, the thunder of hooves hitting the dirt with the force of a battering ram, and a high-pitched scream of pure rage that sounded almost human. As he got closer, he saw him, The stallion was a nightmare made of muscle and fury, a coat as black as a starless night, eyes rolling white with madness. It reared up, hooves like hammers, and slammed against the thick timber fence. The very ground shook beneath Ethan's feet. His gut clenched. This wasn't just a wild horse. This was a monster, a killer. But the challenge had been made in public. To back down now would be to accept his place as a nobody forever. He had to try. He spent the next hour just watching, studying the animal's patterns, the way it charged and retreated, the triggers that sent it into a frenzy. Every time he took a step closer to the fence, the horse would slam against it, its teeth bared. It was hopeless. This wasn't horse breaking. This was suicide. "You the fool trying to tame him?" The voice came from behind him, quiet and flat. Ethan turned. A young woman stood there holding a heavy bucket of feed. She was round-faced, her plain brown hair tied back in a messy knot. Her simple cotton dress was stained with sweat and dust. She was heavy, built for work, not for show like her sisters. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and completely devoid of fear. "I'm Ethan Cole," he said, stating the obvious. "I know who you are," she replied, her voice empty of any emotion. "Whole town's talking about the idiot who took Pa's bet." She walked right past him, her gaze fixed on the monster in the corral. The stallion charged the fence again, kicking and snorting, but the woman didn't even flinch. She simply set the bucket down just outside the fence and took a single step back. "Don't stand too close," she said, not looking at him. "He hates sudden movements." Ethan watched, stunned, as the horse, still agitated, slowly approached the bucket and began to eat. The rage was still there, simmering just below the surface, but it was banked, somehow, by her presence. "You feed him every day?" Ethan asked, his voice full of disbelief. "Pa doesn't trust the ranch hands near him anymore. Not after what happened to Jeb." She didn't elaborate, and Ethan didn't ask. He could guess. "And you're not afraid?" She finally turned to look at him, and for a fleeting second, he saw something in her eyes. Not pity, but a deep, weary resignation, as if she was carrying a weight far too heavy for her years. "He's not mean," she said quietly. "He's just scared. Scared things lash out." The stallion kicked the fence again, a violent, explosive sound that made Ethan jump back instinctively. The woman didn't move a muscle. She just stood her ground, a silent pillar of calm in a storm of fury. "You're the sheriff's daughter," Ethan realized, putting the pieces together. She gave a short, sharp nod. "Clara Hargrove." He looked at her then, really looked at her. She was nothing like her sisters. While they were inside, draped in silk, she was out here, in the dirt and the heat, doing the one job no one else on the ranch dared to do. "Why are you out here?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "Shouldn't you be inside with your sisters?" Her face hardened, the brief flicker of vulnerability gone as quickly as it had appeared. "My sisters don't work," she said, her tone clipped and final. "I do." She picked up the now empty bucket and started walking back toward the house, her message clear. "Our conversation is over." Ethan's mind was racing. She knew something. She understood this animal in a way no one else did. She was the key. "Wait," he called after her. "You know this horse. I need your help." She stopped, her back still to him. Her shoulders were slumped, as if his words had just added another pound to the weight she was already carrying. "You made the bet, Cowboy," she said, her voice drifting back to him on the hot, dry wind. "Not me." And then she was gone, leaving Ethan alone with the monster. He stared at the black stallion, and the horse stared back, its eyes burning with a cold, intelligent hatred. 3 months suddenly felt like a lifetime, but he had no choice. Amelia was worth it. She had to be. The first week was a special kind of hell. Every morning Ethan was at the corral before sunrise, and every morning the stallion tried to kill him. He couldn't get within 10 feet of the fence without the horse charging. Twice, a timber beam splintered under the force of the animal's hooves. Once the stallion kicked with such precision that a shard of wood flew past Ethan's head like a bullet. His ribs were a symphony of purple bruises from being thrown against the fence, and his hands were raw and bleeding from ropes that he could never even get close enough to use. But he kept coming back. Defeat was not an option. And every single morning, Clara was there first. She moved with a quiet efficiency, never saying more than a few words to him. She'd feed the horse, check the water trough, and leave. But Ethan wasn't a fool. He was a watcher, and he started to notice things. He noticed how she hummed a low, soft tune whenever she was near the corral. A simple melody that seemed to cut through the stallion's rage like a warm knife through butter. The horse would still pace and snort, but its ears would twitch listening. It watched her every move, not with hatred, but with a kind of wary respect. One morning after a particularly brutal session that left Ethan sitting in the dirt, gasping for breath with blood dripping from his knuckles, Clara did something different. She walked over and set a canteen of cool water beside him. "You're doing it wrong," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan looked up, his pride stinging, but he was too tired and too sore to argue. "Then tell me how to do it right." She hesitated, casting a nervous glance back toward the big house, as if afraid of being seen. Then she made a decision. She crouched down in the dirt beside him, her practical nature winning out over her fear. "He's not mean," she repeated, her voice firm. "He's hurt." Ethan frowned. "Hurt how?" She pointed a steady finger toward the stallion. "Look. Look at his left flank, just behind the ribs. See that scar?" Ethan squinted, his eyes following her direction. And then he saw it. A long, jagged line of raised, keloid skin, almost hidden by the horse's dark coat. It was the kind of scar left by a whip used with cruel intent over and over again. "Someone whipped him," Clara said, her voice tight with a cold anger that startled him. "That's why he hates ropes. That's why he goes crazy when you approach him from the left. You're triggering his memory of the pain." A sick feeling coiled in Ethan's stomach. "Your father did that?" he asked, his voice low. "No," she said quickly. "The man Pa bought him from. A cruel man who used fear to train his animals. But Pa didn't care. He just wanted a stallion that looked tough, something to brag about." She stood up, brushing the dust from her simple dress. Her face was a mask of grim determination. "If you want to tame him, you can't break his spirit. It's already been broken once. You have to earn his trust." Ethan felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "How? How do I do that?" She looked at him then, her sharp eyes seeming to see right through him, weighing his character, judging his intent. "Start by not treating him like a beast," she said finally. "His name is Shadow. Start by using it." That one word, that one small piece of information, changed everything. The beast had a name, and for the first time Ethan realized he wasn't just fighting a monster. He was trying to save a victim. Over the next few weeks, everything shifted. Following Clara's advice, Ethan stopped trying to conquer Shadow. He put away the ropes, the lassos, the tools of a horse breaker. Instead, he simply sat outside the corral for hours every day, talking to the horse in a low, calm voice. He told Shadow about his ranch, about his dreams, about the loneliness that gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night. He never tried to get closer, never made a sudden move. He just made himself a constant, non-threatening presence. At first, the stallion ignored him, pacing the fence line with suspicion. But slowly, inch by inch, the rage began to recede. The wild look in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of curiosity. He'd stop his pacing and just watch Ethan, his head cocked to one side. Clara, seeing the change in Ethan's approach, began to help more openly. She'd slip out to the stables most evenings after her chores were done, her visits becoming the part of the day Ethan looked forward to most. She was a well of knowledge, teaching him the secrets no one else knew. "He likes oats more than hay, but only at dusk. He calms down if you hum, not sing. He doesn't like loud voices. Never, ever approach him from the left, always from the right. Let him see you coming." Ethan absorbed every piece of advice like a man dying of thirst, and it worked. The change in Shadow was miraculous. One evening, the stallion let Ethan stand just 5 feet away from the fence without charging. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. but he forced himself to remain calm, to breathe slowly and evenly, just as Clara had taught him. He could feel her watching him from the other side of the corral, her arms crossed. "You're learning," she said, her voice laced with a quiet approval that meant more to him than the cheers of the entire town. "Only because you're teaching me," he replied, glancing over at her. She quickly looked away, but not before he saw a faint blush creep up her neck. In that moment, she wasn't just the plain, heavy-set daughter of the sheriff. She was a teacher, a partner. She was beautiful. By the end of the second month, they had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. They'd sit together on the top rail of the fence as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. He told her about losing his parents in the war, about the years he spent working other men's land, saving every last penny to buy his own small piece of the world. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it's mine." Clara listened, her expression soft in the fading light. "Why come here, Ethan?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Why take my father's bet?" Ethan looked down at his calloused hands, the answer catching in his throat. "Because I'm tired of being alone," he confessed. "Tired of people looking right through me like I'm nothing. I thought, I thought if I could prove myself, if I could win something so impossible, maybe I'd finally deserve something more." He took a deep breath and said the name that had driven him from the very beginning. "Maybe I deserve someone like Amelia." He felt Clara flinch beside him, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. When he looked at her, she was smiling, but it was a brittle, fragile thing that didn't reach her eyes. "Amelia doesn't even know your name," she said quietly. "She will," Ethan insisted, his old determination flaring up. "She will, once I tame this horse." Clara slid off the fence rail, her back to him once again. "Good luck, Ethan," she said, her voice sounding strangely hollow. As she walked away into the growing darkness, Ethan was left with a confusing ache in his chest. He didn't understand why her words or the sadness in her voice felt like a punch to the gut. He was getting closer to his dream every day. So why did it suddenly feel like he was chasing the wrong thing? The lines began to blur. Ethan found himself marking time not by the progress he made with Shadow, but by the minutes until Clara would appear at the stables. He started listening for the sound of her footsteps, for the low hum that always announced her arrival. She wasn't like Amelia, all polished and perfect. Clara was real. Her hands were rough, her dress was often smudged with dirt, but her eyes were kind and her spirit was strong. She was patient and smart, and she never, not once, made him feel like he was less than anyone else. She saw him. One afternoon, Ethan rode into town for supplies, and the illusion he'd been chasing was shattered. He saw Amelia stepping out of an elegant carriage, surrounded by a group of laughing, fawning admirers. Her dress shimmered in the sunlight, and she looked exactly like the prize he'd been fighting for. Beautiful, wealthy, untouchable. She glanced his way, her eyes sweeping over him for a fraction of a second before dismissing him as just another dusty cowboy, another face in the crowd. There was no recognition, no curiosity, nothing. And the sharp sting of rejection he'd expected. It was just a dull ache. It didn't hurt nearly as much as he thought it would. That evening, he was quiet, his mood somber as he worked with Shadow in the corral. Clara arrived with a canteen of water and a thick slice of fresh bread. "You don't have to do that," Ethan said, his voice rough. "I know," she replied simply, sitting down in the dirt beside him. They watched the stallion graze peacefully, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. "Why do you help me, Clara?" he asked suddenly, the question that had been nagging at him for weeks. She didn't answer right away, just watched as Shadow nuzzled her outstretched hand over the fence. "Because you're the first person who's ever asked," she said finally, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. Ethan turned and looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past the plain dress, past the extra weight, past the label the town had put on her. He saw Clara. He saw her strength, her quiet dignity, her hidden pain. And he saw the kindness she gave so freely, even to a man who was openly chasing her sister. But the dream of Amelia was a powerful one. It was a dream of acceptance, of status, of finally being seen as worthy. and it was a hard dream to let go of. A few nights later, Ethan stopped at the saloon for a much-needed drink. He kept to himself, nursing a beer at the bar, but he couldn't ignore the loud drunken laughter coming from a corner table. "Heard Cole's been spending all his time with the sheriff's fat daughter," one of the men slurred, his words carrying across the quiet room. "Poor bastard. Probably thinks she'll put in a good word for him with the pretty one." Another man chimed in, his voice thick with malice. "Or maybe he's just got low standards. A woman's a woman in the dark, right?" The table erupted in a chorus of cruel laughter. Something inside Ethan snapped. His vision went red. In 3 long strides, he was across the room. He grabbed the first man by the collar of his shirt, lifted him out of his chair, and slammed him against the wall with a force that shook the entire building. The saloon went dead silent. "Say another word about her," Ethan growled, his face inches from the terrified man's, "and I'll break your jaw." The man's face was ashen. I didn't mean nothing." "Yes, you did," Ethan snarled. "And if I hear you or anyone else in this town disrespect her again, you'll answer to me." He let the man slide to the floor in a heap and stalked out of the saloon, the shocked whispers of the patrons following him into the night. Clara heard about the fight the next day. The stable boy told her, his eyes wide with excitement. When she saw Ethan that evening, her own eyes were glistening with unshed tears. No one had ever stood up for her before. Ever. But as she looked at him, she saw the conflict in his face. He hadn't defended her because he had feelings for her. He had defended her because he was an honorable man, and the louts in the saloon had offended his sense of decency. It was a noble act, but it wasn't a confession of love. His heart, she knew, still belonged to the dream of Amelia. The 3 months were up. The crisp air of fall had settled over Dusty Creek, and with it came the day of reckoning. Word had spread like wildfire. The outsider, the dusty cowboy, was finally going to ride the devil horse. The whole town turned out to see it. The square was even more packed than it had been on Bride's Fair Day. This time, they weren't just there for a wedding auction. They were there for blood sport. Sheriff Hargrove stood on the platform, his arms crossed, that same smug grin plastered across his face. He was certain he was about to watch Ethan Cole get trampled into the dirt. Amelia stood beside him, a vision in emerald green, looking utterly bored by the whole affair. And in the back of the crowd, almost completely hidden from view, stood Clara. She wore the same plain cotton dress she always did, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. Then came the gasp, a collective intake of breath from hundreds of people as Ethan led the black stallion into the center of the square. But it wasn't the same horse. It couldn't be. The creature that followed Ethan was not a monster. It was magnificent. Its black coat gleamed like polished obsidian, its powerful muscles moved with a fluid grace, and its eyes, once wild with fury, were now calm and steady. The crowd murmured in disbelief. "He actually did it." Ethan ignored them. His focus was entirely on Shadow, one hand resting gently on the horse's powerful neck, the other holding the reins loosely. He had spent 3 long months not breaking this animal, but healing him. He had earned his trust, and he wasn't about to betray it now by showing a single ounce of fear. He stopped before the platform, his gaze locking with the sheriff's. Hargrove's grin faltered, his eyes widening in genuine shock. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You got a rope on him." "I did more than that," Ethan said, his voice ringing with a confidence he'd never felt before. And in one smooth, fluid motion, he swung himself onto the stallion's bare back. The crowd held its breath. This was the moment. Shadow shifted under his weight, his muscles bunching, and for a heart-stopping second, it looked as though the old demon was about to resurface. But then Ethan leaned forward, murmuring something soft and low, a secret shared between man and horse. The stallion relaxed instantly. Ethan gently guided him forward, walking him in a slow, calm circle around the square. Then he urged him into a trot, then a canter. The horse responded to his every command, his movements smooth, controlled, and breathtakingly powerful. He was no longer a monster, he was a king. The crowd, forgetting their bloodlust, erupted into a roar of genuine, thunderous cheers. Ethan rode back to the platform and slid gracefully from Shadow's back. He handed the reins to a stunned-looking ranch hand and turned to face the sheriff, his eyes hard as flint. "I've kept my end of the deal," Ethan said, his voice clear and strong enough for everyone in the square to hear. "Now, you keep yours." The sheriff's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been beaten, publicly. The entire town was watching, waiting. He couldn't back down now without looking like a coward and a cheat. The look in his eyes, however, was pure venom. He had been cornered, and he was going to make Ethan pay. "A deal's a deal," the sheriff said slowly, his voice laced with poison. He turned and gestured grandly toward his daughters. The crowd buzzed with excitement, their eyes all turning to the beautiful Amelia. This was it. The poor cowboy had won the princess. But the sheriff's hand didn't stop at Amelia. It moved past her, past a confused-looking Margaret, past a startled Violet. His arm extended fully, his finger pointing toward the very back of the crowd, to the figure trying to hide in the shadows. "Clara!" "Sure no," he boomed, his voice a cruel mockery of a proud father. "Get up here!" The buzzing in the crowd turned to stunned, confused gasps. Clara's face went bone white. Every head in the square turned to stare at her, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning, malicious understanding. "He said his daughter," someone whispered, the words catching like fire. "He didn't say which one." A snicker broke the silence, then another, and another. Soon a wave of cruel, derisive laughter was rolling through the crowd. Clara stood frozen, paralyzed by a humiliation so profound it stole the air from her lungs. "Come on, girl!" the sheriff shouted, enjoying his petty vengeance. "Don't be shy!" The laughter grew louder. Clara forced her legs to move, each step an eternity of shame. The crowd parted for her, not with respect, but with the morbid curiosity of people watching an execution. She climbed the steps to the platform, her eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet. The sheriff grabbed her arm roughly and yanked her forward, presenting her to Ethan like a piece of spoiled meat. "You wanted a daughter, cowboy," he sneered. "Here she is. My daughter." The crowd absolutely erupted. Men slapped their knees, howling with glee. Women covered their mouths, their eyes shining with vicious delight. Amelia turned her head away, her expression one of deep embarrassment. Not for her sister, but for herself, for being associated with such a pathetic scene. Clara just stood there, her head bowed, hot tears of shame streaming down her face, wishing the ground would open up and swallow her whole. Ethan stared, his mind reeling. He looked from the sneering sheriff to the humiliated Clara, and a rage unlike any he had ever known flooded through him. Rage at the town, at their casual cruelty, at the man who would do this to his own child. He had worked for 3 months. He had bled. He had suffered. He had won. And they had turned his victory into a sick, twisted joke. He looked at Amelia, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. She was standing there, a small, relieved smile on her perfect lips. She was glad. Glad she didn't have to marry the dusty cowboy. Glad she had been spared. His dream, the beautiful, shining prize he had fought so hard for, crumbled into dust. And then he looked at Clara. He saw her tears, her shame, the way her shoulders shook with silent sobs. She didn't deserve this. None of this was her fault. He was trapped. The deal had been made in front of the entire town. To refuse now would be to lose everything. His honor, his reputation, what little standing he had fought so hard to gain. He would be branded a coward and a fool. He took a step forward, and the laughter began to die down. The crowd eager to see the final act of this humiliating play. He reached out and gently, so gently, lifted Clara's chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were full of a fire she didn't understand. "You think you've shamed me?" Ethan's voice rang out across the now silent square, clear and defiant. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to them. He turned to face the crowd, his arm sliding protectively around Clara's shoulders. "This woman," he declared, his voice booming with a power no one knew he possessed, "is the reason I tamed that horse. Not luck, not skill, her. She taught me everything I know. She worked beside me every single day while the rest of you sat on your porches and placed your bets on my death. The silence in the square was absolute, thick with the crowd's own shame. She has more strength, more kindness, and more courage in her little finger than every single one of you combined. She is worth more than this entire town. He then turned back to Clara, the fire in his eyes softening into something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "And I will honor my word," he said, his voice now a quiet promise meant only for her. Clara's eyes went wide. Fresh tears spilled over. But this time they were not tears of shame. They were tears of confusion, of disbelief, of a hope so fragile she was afraid to even breathe. But then she looked closer, into the depths of his eyes, and she saw it. The disappointment, the bitterness, the resignation of a man who had been cheated out of his prize. He wasn't choosing her. He was accepting his fate, because he was an honorable man, and he had no other choice. Ethan took her hand. It was cold and trembling in his. "Come on," he said quietly, and he led her down from the platform, away from the stares and the whispers, toward a future neither of them had ever imagined. A future built on a foundation of humiliation and a broken dream. The wedding was a week later, a bleak affair mandated by law to finalize the public contract. The town preacher mumbled the words, his eyes darting around the empty church, as if he expected the sheriff to burst in and call the whole thing off. The only witnesses were a pair of reluctant town officials who couldn't wait to leave. Sheriff Hargrove didn't bother to show up. Neither did Clara's sisters. The only acknowledgement from her family was a brief, cold note from Amelia that simply said, "Congratulations." Clara wore a plain dress she'd made herself. Ethan wore his cleanest shirt. When the preacher got to the part about the kiss, Ethan hesitated for a long, agonizing moment before leaning in and placing a dry, passionless kiss on her cheek. With that, they were bound together, two strangers shackled by a cruel joke. Ethan's ranch was exactly as he described it. Small, a simple wooden cabin, a sturdy barn, and a few acres of dusty grazing land. It wasn't much, but to Ethan, it was everything. To Clara, it felt like a prison. She tried to make it a home. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended a small garden with a fierce determination. She worked with the horses, her quiet confidence and skill undeniable. But Ethan kept his distance. He was never unkind. He was polite, respectful, always thanking her for the meals she prepared. But there was a wall of ice between them, a wall built of his shattered dreams and her crushing humiliation. At night they slept in the same bed, but on opposite sides a chasm of unspoken resentment separating them. Clara would lie awake in the darkness, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, and wonder if he was dreaming of Amelia. She was sure he was. A few weeks after the wedding, Clara had to ride into town for supplies. The moment she stepped into the general store, the whispering started. It was like a physical blow, a wave of malice that made her want to turn and run. Mrs. Calloway, the store owner's wife, greeted her with a smile that was all teeth. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Cole," she chirped, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "How is married life treating you, dear?" The other women in the store tittered behind their hands. "It must be so difficult," another woman added, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "knowing your husband worked so hard for your sister." "Poor man," a third chimed in, "to tame the devil horse, only to end up with, well," her voice trailed off, followed by a burst of muffled laughter. Clara's face burned. She quickly paid for her flour and salt, her hands shaking, and fled the store without a word. She didn't cry until she was miles out of town, the hot tears blurring her vision as she spurred her horse toward the hollow comfort of the ranch. She never told Ethan what happened. What was the point? It would only remind him of the bargain he'd been forced to accept. A month into their mockery of a marriage, it was Ethan's turn to face the town. He rode in to purchase a new saddle, but as he approached the mercantile, he saw her, Amelia. She was standing outside holding court with a group of wealthy, well-dressed ranchers. She looked radiant, laughing at something one of the men said, her head thrown back in a gesture of effortless grace. She was everything he had once wanted, everything he had thought he deserved. And as he watched her, a bitter, painful ache spread through his chest. This should have been his life. He should have been the one standing beside her, the envy of every man in town. Instead, he was trapped in a small cabin with a wife he hadn't chosen, a living, breathing symbol of his failure. He turned his horse around and rode home, the saddle forgotten. The wall between him and Clara grew higher, thicker, colder. He threw himself into his work, from sunup to sundown, trying to exhaust the bitterness out of his body. Clara worked right alongside him, her skill with the horses a constant, silent reproach. She was a better trainer than he was. She was calmer, more intuitive, able to gentle the most stubborn colt with a soft word and a patient hand. But he could barely bring himself to acknowledge it. Every success she had was just another reminder of the Hargrove she wasn't. One evening, after a grueling day of mending fences under a relentless sun, Clara made his favorite meal, a rich beef stew with thick, crusty bread still warm from the oven. He ate in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Is it good?" Clara finally asked, her voice small and tentative. "It's fine. Thank you," he replied, his tone flat and empty. He didn't look at her. He just kept eating. Clara felt her heart, which had been slowly breaking for months, finally shatter into a million tiny pieces. Later that night, she woke to find his side of the bed empty. A sliver of moonlight cut through the cabin window, and she saw him. He was outside, sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She couldn't hear his words, but she could feel his despair radiating through the thin wooden walls. She knew what he was saying. He was asking God, or the uncaring stars, what he had done to deserve this. A wife he didn't want, a life he hadn't chosen, a constant, suffocating reminder of his public humiliation. A fresh wave of tears streamed down Clara's face. She had known he didn't love her, but hearing the raw, unfiltered proof of his misery was a pain deeper than any she had ever imagined. She backed away from the window, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle a sob. She couldn't live like this anymore. It was killing her, and it was killing him too. The next morning, Clara made a decision. She waited until after supper, until the last of the dishes were washed and put away. Ethan was at the small wooden table, hunched over a ledger, the flickering lantern light casting long shadows across his tired face. "Ethan," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "I need to say something." He looked up, his expression wary. "I know this isn't what you wanted," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush before she could lose her nerve. "I know you wanted Amelia. I know you only married me to protect your honor. You didn't have a choice." He opened his mouth to protest, to say something polite and meaningless, but she held up a hand to stop him. "It's okay," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I understand, but you don't have to stay trapped here with me." His eyes widened slightly. "What are you saying, Clara?" "I'm saying you should leave," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Go. Start over somewhere else. Find someone you can actually love. I'll tell everyone it was my fault, that I couldn't be the wife you needed. No one will blame you." She took a ragged breath. "You worked so hard. You deserve the life you dreamed of, Ethan. Not, not this." For a long, silent moment, Ethan just stared at her, his face unreadable. Then something inside him seemed to break. The hardness in his eyes softened. The tight line of his jaw unclenched. He stood up slowly, and Clara braced herself for his agreement, for the final, crushing blow. "You think I want to leave?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Don't you?" she whispered, her heart aching. He didn't answer. Instead, he began to pace the small cabin, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. "I thought I did," he admitted, his voice so quiet she could barely hear him. "For months, that's all I thought about. I thought about Amelia. I thought about the life I was supposed to have, the life I earned." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes boring into hers. "But you know what Amelia has never done? She's never mended my shirt. She's never brought me cool water when I was sweating in the sun. She never sat with me in silence after a hard day. She never taught me a damn thing worth knowing. She never even looked at me like I was a human being." His voice cracked. "You did all of that, every single day. You've worked harder on this ranch than I have. You've shown me more kindness and decency than I ever deserved, especially after how I've treated you." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. "I was a fool, Clara. I was so blinded by the idea of a prize that I couldn't see the treasure right in front of me. I didn't see you." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his rough hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "But I see you now, and I don't want to leave. I want to stay. I want to build this life, right here, with you. Not because I have to, because I choose to." He took a deep, shaky breath. "It took me way too long to see it, and I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused you. But I love you, Clara Hargrove Cole. Not out of pity, not out of obligation. I love you for who you are." The dam inside Clara finally broke. She collapsed against him, sobbing, not with the pain of humiliation, but with the overwhelming, earth-shattering relief of being seen, of being chosen. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, protectively. And for the first time since their wedding day, the cold, suffocating wall between them didn't just crack. It crumbled into dust. In the months that followed, the ranch was transformed. But the real transformation was between Ethan and Clara. They worked side by side, their hands often brushing as they passed tools or adjusted harnesses. They talked for hours, sharing dreams and fears under the vast, starry sky. They laughed. It was a sound that had been absent for so long, and it filled the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. The physical distance between them and their bed disappeared, replaced by a deep and passionate intimacy that healed the wounds of their past. This wasn't the fiery, idealized love Ethan had dreamed of with Amelia. This was something better. It was real. It was a love built on a foundation of shared work, mutual respect, and the quiet, steady choice to see the best in each other every single day. As their love bloomed, so did their reputation. Clara's gift with horses was undeniable, and when combined with Ethan's strength and business sense, they became an unstoppable team. Word began to spread about the Coles, the couple who could gentle any horse, no matter how broken or wild. People started bringing them their problem animals, horses that other trainers had given up on. And one by one, Ethan and Clara worked their magic, healing the animals with the same patience and understanding they had used to heal each other. Their small ranch began to thrive. One day, a young girl no older than 16 showed up at their gate. She was heavy-set, with slumped shoulders and eyes that were firmly fixed on the ground, as if she were ashamed to even exist. "I heard you train horses," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. But, but people say I'm too big, too clumsy. They say I'll just scare the animals." Clara looked at the girl and saw a painful reflection of her younger self. She smiled gently. "Come here," she said, leading the girl toward a corral where a young, nervous mare was pacing. "This is Rosie. When we got her, she was terrified of everything. Wouldn't let anyone near her, but I worked with her. I earned her trust." Clara turned to the girl, her eyes full of a fierce compassion. "People will always try to tell you who you are and what you can't do. Don't you ever let them. The only voice that matters is the one inside you." The girl's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Will you teach me?" "Yes," Clara said without a moment's hesitation. "We will." The girl was the first of many. Soon the Cole Ranch became more than just a horse training facility. It became a refuge, a safe haven for the outcasts, the misfits, the young people the town of Dusty Creek had written off. Ethan and Clara didn't just teach them how to work with horses. They taught them about dignity, about self-respect, about the quiet power of refusing to be defined by the cruelty of others. They were building more than a business. They were building a community. 2 years to the day after their humiliating wedding, the annual Bride's Fair returned to Dusty Creek. This time, Ethan and Clara walked through the town square together, hand in hand. The whispers that followed them were different now. "That's the Coles," a man said, his voice full of respect. "Best horse trainers in the territory. Heard they took in that Miller boy after his pa kicked him out. Turned his life around." "Never thought that marriage would last," a woman admitted to her friend. "Goes to show, you can't always judge a book by its cover." They walked past the platform, a place that had once been the stage for their deepest shame. Sheriff Hargrove was there, looking older, smaller, his face etched with the bitterness of a man whose power was slipping away. Beside him stood Amelia. She was still beautiful, still draped in expensive silk, but a hard, brittle quality had settled in her eyes. She was still unmarried. Her gaze met Ethan's across the square. For a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or envy. But Ethan felt nothing. No anger, no longing, no pain. He just squeezed Clara's hand tighter and kept walking. That dream was dead, and he was grateful for it. That evening, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky. The ranch was alive with the sounds of laughter and the gentle nickering of horses. It was the sound of the life they had built, a life more beautiful and fulfilling than anything Ethan had ever dared to imagine. "Do you ever think about that day?" Clara asked softly. "The day my father pushed me forward?" Ethan turned to look at his wife. The setting sun caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. Her face, which he had once seen as plain, was the most beautiful face in the world to him. "All the time," he admitted. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" she asked, her voice small. "No," he said, his voice full of a conviction that left no room for doubt. "If the sheriff had given me Amelia, I would have spent my whole life chasing a pretty illusion. I would have been miserable, and I never would have known what true happiness felt like." He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I spent so long thinking I had to earn the right to be seen. But you, Clara, you saw me from the very beginning. You saw the man I wanted to be, even when I couldn't see him myself." Clara's eyes glistened. "And you saw me," she whispered, "even when I didn't see myself." They sat in a comfortable silence, their life's work spread out before them, a testament to a love that had been forged not in a grand romantic gesture, but in the quiet, daily acts of choosing each other over and over again. The town of Dusty Creek would talk about them for years. Some would always say Ethan Cole was a fool who got tricked into marrying the wrong sister. But those who knew better, those who had seen the light and laughter on their ranch, knew the truth. They knew he was the smartest, luckiest man in the territory. He had lost a prize but gained a partner. He had been cheated out of a dream, but had woken up to a reality that was infinitely better. They laughed when she was pushed forward, but the cowboy learned what the town never could, that the strongest heart is often the one others try to hide, and the greatest love is the one you never saw coming. I know many of you watching have your own stories about finding love in unexpected places, or learning that what you thought you wanted wasn't what you needed at all. Real life is messy. Real love is complicated, but it's also beautiful and worth fighting for. If you've ever been judged by your cover or had to fight to prove your worth, share your wisdom in the comments below. Your story might be the one that gives someone else the strength to keep going. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales about the quiet strength it takes to build a life worth living.